Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the cold airplane window as London came into view below. The city sprawled out like a massive puzzle with its winding river and ancient buildings mixed with modern towers. Her heart pounded with excitement as she clutched her worn travel journal that had been her constant companion for 3 long years of planning and saving. The 28-year-old elementary school teacher from Maplewood, Ohio, had never traveled anywhere outside her home state before. Every weekend for the past 3 years, she had worked at the local diners serving coffee and pie, 2 truck drivers and families just to save enough money for this one trip. Her small apartment was filled with London guidebooks and printed articles about places she wanted to visit. The walls were covered with pictures of Big Ben, the London Eye, and Buckingham Palace that she had cut out from magazines. Sarah had grown up in a military family where money was always tight. Her father's staff sergeant, Robert Martinez, had served 3 tours overseas, and her mother worked double shifts at the hospital to keep the family afloat. There were no fancy vacations or trips to Disney World like her classmates enjoyed, but Sarah never complained because she understood sacrifice and hard work from watching her parents. The plane touched down at Heathrow Airport, and Sarah felt like she might burst with happiness. She had practiced British phrases in front of her mirror at home and even learned some history about the royal family. Her suitcase was packed with comfortable walking shoes, a rain jacket, and her father's old camera that he had given her as a going-away present. The taxi ride into central London was like watching a movie come to life. Double-decker buses rumbled past red phone boxes that Sarah had only seen in pictures. People walked quickly on the sidewalks wearing long coats and carrying black umbrellas even though it was not raining. The driver spoke with a thick accent that Sarah found charming and difficult to understand at the same time. Her small hotel room in Bloomsbury was nothing fancy, but it had a window that looked out onto a quiet street lined with old townhouses. Sarah unpacked her few belongings and spread her guidebooks across the narrow bed. She had mapped out every day of her week-long stay with military precision, learned from her father. Tomorrow would be her first full day, and she planned to start with the most important destination on her list. That evening, Sarah walked through the neighborhood to get familiar with her surroundings. The streets were busy with people heading home from work and students carrying backpacks who reminded her of her own pupils back in Ohio. She stopped at a small cafe and ordered fish and chips, trying to sound natural when she asked for it. The elderly woman behind the counter smiled warmly and asked where she was visiting from. When Sarah mentioned Ohio, the woman's eyes lit up and she began telling stories about her nephew who lived in Cincinnati. They talked for 20 minutes about the differences between American and British culture while Sarah ate her dinner. The kindness of this stranger made Sarah feel welcome and less nervous about being so far from home. Back in her hotel room, Sarah called her parents on the tiny international phone plan she had purchased. Her mother wanted to know if she was eating enough and staying safe, while her father asked practical questions about her hotel security and transportation. Her younger brother Miguel, who was now stationed at Fort Bragg, teased her about becoming a world traveler, but she could hear the pride in his voice. Sarah had trouble sleeping that first night. Because of the time difference and her excitement about the next day, she kept checking her alarm clock and reviewing her plans in her head. Buckingham Palace and the changing of the guard ceremony were scheduled for 11 in the morning. She had read that tourists needed to arrive early to get a good viewing spot because the ceremony was incredibly popular. At sunrise, Sarah was already awake and getting dressed in her most comfortable clothes. She had chosen khaki pants, a blue sweater, and her sturdy walking shoes. Around her neck hung her father's camera, and in her backpack she carried water bottles, snacks, and her guidebook, marked with yellow highlighter on every page about the royal guards. The breakfast room at her hotel was small and filled with other tourists speaking different languages. Sarah listened to conversations in French, German, and what she thought might be Japanese while she ate toast and drank strong tea. An elderly couple from Australia sat at the table next to hers, and they began chatting about their travel plans. Australian woman Margaret had been to London 12 times, and she gave Sarah advice about the best spots to watch the ceremony. She explained that the guards were real soldiers who took their duties very seriously, and that tourists should be respectful during the ceremony. Margaret also warned Sarah that the crowds could be overwhelming, and that she should keep her belongings secure. After breakfast, Sarah took the underground for the first time in her life. The subway system seemed impossibly complicated with its colorful maps and multiple lines going in every direction. She studied the map carefully and asked for help from a transit worker who patiently explained which train to take to get to Green Park Station. The train car was packed with commuters, reading newspapers and checking their phones. Sarah noticed how quietly everyone behaved compared to the buses back home, where people often talked loudly on their phones or to each other. She tried to blend in by staying quiet and watching the stations flash by through the windows. When she emerged from Green Park Station, Sarah could already see other tourists walking toward Buckingham Palace with cameras and guidebooks just like hers. The morning air was crisp and cool, with gray clouds threatening rain later in the day. Sarah joined the stream of people walking through the park toward the palace. Her first glimpse of Buckingham Palace took her breath away. The massive building was even more impressive in person than in all the photographs she had studied. The golden gates gleamed in the morning light, and the famous balcony where the royal family appeared for special occasions looked both grand and surprisingly small at the same time. Sarah found a spot along the fence where she could see clearly, and began taking pictures with her father's camera. She wanted to capture every detail to share with her family back home. Other tourists around her were doing the same thing, speaking in various languages and pointing excitedly at different parts of the building. A group of schoolchildren from France had arrived with their teacher, and they were practicing English phrases while looking at the palace. Sarah smiled listening to them stumble over words, just like her students back in Ohio did when they were learning something new. She helped one little girl figure out how to say palace correctly, and the child beamed with pride. As the morning progressed, more and more people gathered around the palace gates. Sarah checked her watch and saw that it was almost 10:30. In just 30 minutes, the famous changing of the guard ceremony would begin, and she would witness something she had dreamed about for years. She adjusted her father's camera strap and pulled out her guidebook one more time to review the details about what she was about to see. The ceremony would involve dozens of guards in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats, marching in perfect formation while a military band played traditional British music. Sarah had no idea that in just a few hours she would become part of a story that would touch hearts around the world and remind people everywhere about the power of simple human kindness. The crowd around Buckingham Palace grew thicker by the minute, as tourists from every corner of the world gathered for the famous ceremony. Sarah found herself squeezed between a large German family with 3 excited children and a group of Japanese tourists who were taking photos of everything, including the pigeons walking on the ground. At exactly 11 o'clock, the first sounds of marching boots echoed across the courtyard. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat as she strained to see over the heads of taller people in front of her. The crowd pushed forward slightly, and everyone seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. Camera phones appeared everywhere like a forest of small screens, all pointed toward the palace gates. The first group of guards appeared marching in perfect formation down the mall. Their red tunics were so bright they seemed to glow in the morning light, and their tall, black bearskin hats made them look like giants. Sarah had read that these hats were made from real bear fur and weighed several pounds, but the guards carried themselves with such grace that they made it look effortless. Behind the guards came a military band, playing traditional British marching music. The brass instruments caught the sunlight, and the drum beats seemed to vibrate through the ground and into Sarah's chest. She had never heard anything so grand and ceremonial in her small town back in Ohio. The music made her think of her father and brother, and all the military ceremonies she had attended with her family over the years. Sarah raised her father's old camera and began taking pictures, but the people in front of her kept moving and blocking her view. A tall man in a baseball cap stepped directly in front of her just as she was about to capture the perfect shot. She politely asked him to move slightly, but he did not hear her over the noise of the crowd and the music. The guards moved with mechanical precision as they approached the palace gates. Each step was identical, and their faces showed no emotion whatsoever. Sarah wondered how they managed to stay so focused with hundreds of tourists watching their every move and taking pictures constantly. She had heard that becoming a royal guard required years of training and discipline. A little girl next to Sarah started crying because she could not see anything over the adults surrounding her. Without thinking, Sarah lifted the child onto her shoulders so she could get a better view. The girl's mother smiled gratefully and said something in what Sarah thought was Italian. The universal language of kindness needed no translation. The ceremony continued with the old guard meeting the new guard in the palace courtyard. Sarah watched in fascination as the guards performed their ancient ritual of transferring responsibility for protecting the palace. Every movement had meaning and history stretching back hundreds of years. She felt privileged to witness something so steeped in tradition and culture. One guard in particular caught Sarah's attention. He looked young, perhaps close to her own age, with kind eyes that seemed to sparkle despite his serious military bearing. Unlike some of the other guards who looked stern and intimidating, this one had a gentle quality that reminded Sarah of her students back home. She found herself watching him more closely than the others. The guard stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from stone. His red uniform was immaculate, without a single wrinkle or speck of dust. The gold buttons and trim gleamed in the sunlight, and his white gloves were spotless. Sarah marveled at how he could stand so motionless for so long, especially in the warm July weather. Sweat began to form on the guards' foreheads. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Sarah could see tiny beads of perspiration on the young guard's face, but he never moved or showed any sign of discomfort. She thought about how difficult it must be to maintain such discipline while tourists surrounded him, making noise and taking pictures. Some of the other tourists began trying to get reactions From the guards, they made silly faces, waved their hands, and even told jokes loudly, hoping to see the famous soldiers break character. Sarah felt embarrassed by their behavior and thought it was disrespectful to these men who were simply doing their duty to their country. The German family next to Sarah had their children pose for pictures right in front of the guards. The youngest boy made funny faces and tried to imitate the guard's serious expression, while his parents laughed and took dozens of photos. Sarah wondered what the guards thought about being treated like tourist attractions rather than respected soldiers. A group of teenagers from what sounded like Australia began making loud comments about the guards' uniforms and hats. They questioned why anyone would want to stand still for hours in heavy wool clothing during summer weather. Their lack of understanding about military service and tradition bothered Sarah, who had grown up respecting soldiers and their sacrifices. As the ceremony progressed, Sarah noticed that the young guard she had been watching seemed different from his colleagues. While the others maintained completely blank expressions, he occasionally showed the slightest hint of humanity in his eyes. When a small child waved at him, Sarah thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch almost imperceptibly. The military band played several different marching tunes while the guards performed their intricate movements around the palace courtyard. Sarah recognized some of the melodies from movies and television shows, but hearing them performed live by a real military band was completely different. The music seemed to transport her to another time when such ceremonies were part of daily life rather than tourist attractions. During a brief pause in the ceremony, Sarah overheard two British women discussing the guards behind her. One mentioned that her nephew had served as a royal guard and described how difficult the training was. The guards had to pass strict physical and mental tests and maintain perfect discipline at all times while on duty. The woman explained that the guards were real soldiers who had served in combat zones around the world before being selected for this prestigious assignment. They were not just ceremonial figures but trained warriors who took their duty to protect the royal family very seriously. This information made Sarah respect them even more. A sudden commotion near the front of the crowd caught Sarah's attention. Someone had dropped their phone and it had slid close to one of the guard's feet. Several tourists were pointing and talking excitedly about whether the guard would help retrieve it or continue standing at attention. The guard remained motionless as if the phone did not exist. Sarah thought about her own family and how her father had taught her to respect military service from a young age. She remembered attending ceremonies at the base where her father was stationed and how proud she felt watching soldiers perform their duties with such dedication. These royal guards reminded her of her father and brother and all the sacrifices military families made. The crowd began to thin slightly as some tourists left to visit other attractions around London. Sarah remained in her spot, determined to watch the entire ceremony from beginning to end. She wanted to honor these guards by giving them her full attention and respect rather than treating them as just another photo opportunity. The young guard who had captured her attention continued to stand perfectly still, but Sarah noticed subtle signs that he was human beneath the formal uniform. She saw him blink slowly when dust blew near his eyes and noticed how he seemed to focus on different points in the distance to maintain his concentration. As the ceremony entered its final phase, Sarah felt a strange connection to this young soldier who reminded her so much of her own brother. The ceremony reached its most intense moment as the new guards took their positions around Buckingham Palace. Sarah watched the young guard she had been observing as he marched to his post near the main gate. His movements were precise and calculated, like a perfectly programmed machine, but his eyes held a depth that machines could never possess. The sun had grown stronger, and Sarah could see beads of sweat forming on the guard's face beneath his heavy bearskin hat. The wool uniform that looked so magnificent and proud must have felt like wearing a thick blanket in the July heat. Yet the guard showed no signs of discomfort or fatigue as he assumed his position and became as still as a marble statue. Sarah found herself thinking about her younger brother Miguel, who was currently stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. Miguel had joined the Army 2 years ago after graduating high school, and Sarah knew how challenging military life could be for young men far from home. She wondered if this guard had family somewhere worrying about him just like her family worried about Miguel during his deployment training. The crowd around Sarah grew more restless as people began to realize the main ceremony was ending. Many tourists started checking their phones and planning their next destination, but Sarah remained focused on the guard. Something about his stillness and dedication touched her heart in a way she had not expected when she planned this trip. A mother with 2 small children stood near Sarah, struggling to keep them quiet and entertained. The children were tired and hungry after standing in the crowd for over an hour, and they began to whine and complain. The mother looked embarrassed as other tourists glanced at them with annoyed expressions. Sarah smiled at the woman and offered her children some crackers from her backpack while helping the family. Sarah noticed that the young guard had subtly shifted his gaze toward the crying children. For just a moment, his expression seemed to soften with understanding rather than the blank military stare he was supposed to maintain. This tiny glimpse of humanity made Sarah feel even more connected to him. The military band finished their final song and began to pack up their instruments. Most of the tourists assumed the ceremony was completely over and started dispersing toward other parts of London. However, Sarah had read in her guidebook that the guards would remain at their posts for hours, continuing their silent watch over the palace. A group of American college students pushed past Sarah as they headed toward the exit. One of them complained loudly about how boring it was to watch people stand still without doing anything interesting. His friend agreed and said they should have gone to see the crown jewels, instead of wasting time on what he called a bunch of guys in funny hats. Their comments made Sarah angry because she understood the honor and sacrifice involved in military service. These guards were not entertainment or tourist attractions, but dedicated soldiers performing an important duty. She thought about her father, who had stood guard at military bases around the world, often in dangerous conditions while protecting other people. As more tourists left, Sarah found herself with a clearer view of the young guard. She could see his face more clearly now and noticed that he looked tired, despite his perfect posture. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he might have been on duty for many hours, or perhaps had not slept well the night before. Sarah began to imagine what this guard's life might be like when he was not on duty. Did he have a girlfriend or wife who missed him while he worked long hours at the palace? Did he have hobbies or interests outside of his military service? Did he ever feel lonely standing silently for hours while thousands of strangers stared at him and took his picture? The thought of loneliness struck Sarah particularly hard because she often felt isolated in her small town back in Ohio. Teaching elementary school was rewarding, but it could be lonely work, especially for a single woman in her late 20s. She spent most of her time with children and had few close friends her own age who understood her dreams and ambitions. A sudden wave of empathy washed over Sarah as she continued watching the guard. She saw in him a reflection of her own feelings, of duty, responsibility, and sometimes isolation. Both of them had chosen careers focused on serving others, whether protecting royalty or educating children, but both roles required personal sacrifices that others might not understand. The remaining tourists around Sarah were mostly older couples and families with patient children, who seemed content to observe the guards quietly. The atmosphere had become more respectful now that the rowdy groups had moved on to other attractions. Sarah appreciated this calmer environment, which felt more appropriate for honoring these dedicated soldiers. A gentle breeze stirred the flags above Buckingham Palace, and Sarah watched as the guard remained completely motionless despite the wind blowing around him. His discipline was remarkable, but she found herself wondering about the person beneath the uniform. What were his hopes and dreams beyond his military service? What made him laugh when he was off duty? What worried him late at night when he was alone with his thoughts? Sarah checked her watch and realized she had been standing in the same spot for nearly 3 hours. Her feet ached in her walking shoes and her shoulders were sore from carrying her backpack, but she felt reluctant to leave. Something about this experience felt important in a way she could not quite explain to herself. The guard continued his silent vigil as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard. Sarah marveled at his endurance and wondered how much longer he would be required to stand at attention. She had read that guard duty shifts could last several hours, and the soldiers were expected to maintain perfect discipline throughout their entire assignment. A photographer with professional equipment set up near Sarah and began taking artistic shots of the guards from different angles. He moved quietly and respectfully, unlike some of the tourists who had been making noise and trying to get reactions earlier. Sarah appreciated his professional approach to documenting these dedicated soldiers. As Sarah watched the photographer work, she thought about her father camera hanging around her neck. She had taken dozens of pictures during the ceremony, but now she wondered if she should continue photographing the guard or simply observe him with respect. There seemed to be something intrusive about treating him like a tourist attraction when he was performing such serious duty. The afternoon light began to change as clouds moved across the sky, casting the palace courtyard in alternating patterns of sunshine and shadow. The guard remained as steady as a lighthouse in a storm, completely unaffected by the changing conditions around him. His dedication impressed Sarah more with each passing minute. Sarah found herself thinking about her students back in Ohio and how she tried to teach them about respect and service to others. This guard was a perfect example of putting duty before personal comfort, and she wished her students could see his dedication firsthand. They would learn valuable lessons about commitment and sacrifice from observing his behavior. A feeling began growing in Sarah's chest that she could not quite identify. It was part admiration, part sympathy, and part something else entirely. The guard looked so young and serious, standing alone in his red uniform while hundreds of strangers observed him throughout the day. Sarah wondered if anyone ever thanked him for his service or if people simply took his dedication for granted. The emotional weight of watching this solitary figure performing his duty with such dignity began to overwhelm Sarah in ways she had not anticipated when she planned her London vacation. The afternoon sun climbed higher in the London sky as Sarah continued her quiet vigil beside the palace gates. Most of the ceremonial crowds had dispersed to explore other parts of the city, but Sarah felt rooted to her spot watching the young guard who had captured her attention. Something deep inside her chest pulled at her heart as she observed his unwavering dedication to duty. The guard had been standing perfectly still for over 2 hours now, and Sarah could see the physical toll it was taking on him. Small streams of perspiration ran down his face from beneath the heavy bearskin hat, but he never lifted a hand to wipe them away. His red wool uniform must have felt like wearing winter clothes in summer heat, yet his posture remained straight and proud. Sarah thought about the last phone call she had with her brother, Miguel, before leaving Ohio. He had described the challenges of military training and how difficult it was to maintain discipline during long hours of duty. Miguel had sounded tired and homesick during their conversation, and Sarah had wished she could give him a hug to show her support and love. The memory of her brother's voice made Sarah look at the guard with fresh eyes. Beneath the formal uniform and serious expression, she saw someone who might be missing his own family. Perhaps he had a sister somewhere who worried about him just like Sarah worried about Miguel. The thought made her heart ache with sympathy for this stranger who was performing his duty so far from whatever home he knew. A small group of elderly British tourists approached the guard and began discussing his uniform and equipment in hushed voices. They spoke with knowledge and respect about the history of the Royal Guards and the significance of their role in protecting the monarchy. Sarah listened carefully to their conversation and learned that many guards served multiple tours of duty and considered their assignment a great honor. One of the elderly men mentioned that his own grandson had applied to become a Royal Guard, but had not been selected due to the extremely high standards required. The competition was fierce, and only the most disciplined and dedicated soldiers earned the privilege of serving at Buckingham Palace. This information made Sarah respect the young guard even more. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah noticed subtle changes in the guard's demeanor. While he maintained his rigid posture, his eyes occasionally showed signs of fatigue and strain. She wondered how many more hours he would be required to stand at attention before being relieved by another soldier. The physical and mental demands of his job seemed almost superhuman. A tour guide with a small group of visitors stopped near Sarah and began explaining the strict rules that governed the Royal Guard's behavior. They were forbidden from speaking, moving, or reacting to anything happening around them while on duty. Breaking these rules could result in serious disciplinary action, or even dismissal from their prestigious position. The tour guide also mentioned that the guards were real soldiers who had served in combat zones before being selected for ceremonial duty. Many had completed dangerous missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflict areas around the world. They were not actors or performers, but genuine military personnel with extensive training and experience. This information shocked Sarah, because she had not realized the guards were combat veterans. The young man she had been watching might have seen terrible things and experienced trauma that civilians like herself could never imagine. Yet here he stood with quiet dignity, serving his country in a different but equally important way. Sarah began to feel overwhelmed by emotions she struggled to understand. Her heart went out to this brave young soldier who reminded her so much of her own brother. She imagined him writing letters home to worried parents or calling a girlfriend late at night when his shift ended. The thought of his possible loneliness and the weight of his responsibilities made her eyes fill with tears. A mother, pushing a stroller, approached the area where Sarah was standing. Her baby began crying loudly, and the woman looked embarrassed as other tourists glanced in their direction. Sarah noticed the guard eyes flicker slightly toward the sound of the crying child, and for just a moment his expression seemed to soften with understanding rather than military stoicism. The brief glimpse of humanity in the guard's reaction to the crying baby touched Sarah deeply. It confirmed what she had suspected all along, that beneath the formal uniform beat the heart of a caring person, who probably missed the simple joys of normal life while performing his duty. She wondered if he ever got to hold babies or play with children when he was off duty. Sarah found her emotions building to a point where she could barely contain them. The combination of missing her own family, thinking about her brother in the military, and feeling such strong empathy for this stranger created a storm of feelings in her chest. She had always been an emotional person who wore her heart on her sleeve, but this intensity surprised even her. The guard continued his silent watch as shadows began to lengthen across the palace courtyard. Sarah estimated he had been standing motionless for nearly 3 hours, and she marveled at his endurance. Her own feet were aching from standing on the hard pavement for so long, yet she felt compelled to remain as a witness to his dedication. A group of rowdy teenagers approached the guard's position and began making loud jokes and taking selfies. They seemed oblivious to the disrespect they were showing to someone who was performing an important duty. Sarah felt angry at their behavior and wished she could explain to them what military service meant to families like hers. One of the teenagers dared his friend to try to make the guard laugh or react in some way. They began making funny faces and telling jokes loudly while taking pictures of themselves with the stoic soldier in the background. Sarah watched the guard's face carefully and saw his jaw tighten slightly with what might have been annoyance or frustration. The teenagers eventually grew bored and moved on to bother other guards around the palace, but their behavior left Sarah feeling protective of the young soldier. She had been observing. She wanted to apologize on behalf of all the thoughtless tourists who treated him like entertainment rather than a dedicated serviceman deserving of respect. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah realized she was experiencing something she had never felt before. It was more than sympathy or admiration for the guard's duty. It felt like a deep human connection to someone who was carrying burdens and responsibilities that others took for granted. She saw in him a reflection of all the soldiers who served quietly and without recognition. The emotional weight of these realizations combined with her own loneliness and her worry for her brother began to overwhelm Sarah's usual self-control. Tears started forming in her eyes as she continued watching the guard maintain his perfect posture, despite the obvious physical and mental challenges of his assignment. Sarah felt an almost irresistible urge to do something to acknowledge this young man's sacrifice and dedication. Her heart was telling her to reach out somehow, to let him know that at least one person in the crowd of tourists understood and appreciated what he was doing. The feeling grew stronger with each passing minute until it became difficult to ignore. The logical part of Sarah's mind knew that approaching a royal guard was inappropriate and probably against regulations, but her emotional side was being driven by something deeper than logic. It was the same impulse that made her help struggling students in her classroom or comfort crying children who missed their parents. She could not stand to see someone suffering alone without offering some gesture of support. The internal battle between her head and her heart intensified as Sarah continued watching the guard standing so still and dignified in the afternoon sun. The moment arrived without warning, like a dam breaking inside Sarah's heart. She had been standing there for hours, watching this young guard maintain his perfect discipline, while her emotions built to an unbearable level. The combination of thinking about her brother, missing her family, and feeling such deep empathy for this stranger finally overwhelmed her. Usual caution and common sense. Sarah stepped forward from the small crowd of remaining tourists without consciously deciding to do so. Her feet moved as if they had their own will, carrying her closer to the young guard, who had captured her attention and sympathy throughout the long afternoon. The logical part of her mind screamed warnings about rules and regulations, but her heart was louder than her thoughts. The guard remained perfectly still as Sarah approached, but she could see his eyes tracking her movement. His military training probably taught him to be aware of everyone around him, even while maintaining his stoic pose. Sarah wondered what he was thinking as this unknown American woman walked directly toward him instead of staying safely behind the barriers like all the other tourists. Without planning what she would do, Sarah found herself standing directly in front of the guard. Up close, she could see the details of his young face more clearly. He looked tired and strained from hours of standing at attention in the summer heat. Beads of sweat had dried on his forehead, leaving small salt stains on his skin beneath the heavy bearskin hat. Sarah looked into the guard's eyes and saw something that broke her heart completely. Behind his military bearing and disciplined expression, she glimpsed a deep sadness that reminded her painfully of her brother during his most difficult training periods. This young man was carrying burdens that went far beyond his ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace. Before she could stop herself or think about the consequences, Sarah opened her arms and gently wrapped them around the guard in a soft embrace. The moment her arms encircled his red wool uniform, she felt his entire body tense with shock. The crowd of tourists behind her gasped audibly, and she heard cameras clicking frantically as people captured this unprecedented scene. For several seconds, the guard remained frozen in his military position while Sarah held him gently. She could feel his heart beating rapidly beneath the thick fabric of his uniform and sensed the internal struggle between his training and his humanity. Sarah whispered softly near his ear that everything would be okay, and that someone cared about his sacrifice and service. Then something extraordinary happened that no one, including Sarah, had expected. Instead of pushing her away or calling for security, the young guard did something that went against every rule in his military handbook. His rigid posture softened slightly, and Sarah felt one of his white-gloved hands come up to rest gently on her shoulder. The guard leaned down just enough to whisper something in Sarah's ear that only she could hear. His voice was quiet and rough with emotion as he said, "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists in this world." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and tears began streaming down her face as she understood the pain behind his simple statement. The crowd had gone completely silent watching this incredible moment unfold before their eyes. Even the security guards who had started moving toward them seemed to slow their approach as they recognized something sacred was happening. Cameras continued clicking, but somehow the sound seemed muted and respectful rather than intrusive. Sarah slowly released her embrace and stepped back to look at the guard one final time. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, and for just a moment, he allowed himself the smallest smile she had ever seen. It was barely visible to anyone watching, but Sarah felt the warmth of it reach deep into her soul before he returned to his rigid military bearing. The guard whispered one more thing to Sarah as she prepared to step away. He told her that his name was James and that he had recently lost his sister in a car accident back home in Yorkshire. The ceremonial duty at Buckingham Palace had become his way of honoring her memory by serving something greater than himself, but some days the grief felt overwhelming. Sarah nodded with understanding as fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. She told James softly that her brother was also serving in the military, and that she would pray for both of them to stay safe and find peace. James blinked slowly in acknowledgement, before returning his gaze to the distant horizon and resuming his perfect stillness. As Sarah backed away from James, she became aware of the crowd around her for the first time since her impulsive decision to approach him. Instead of angry faces or disapproving looks, she saw expressions of wonder and emotion on the faces of the tourists who had witnessed their exchange. Many people were wiping away tears, and several were nodding with approval at what they had seen. An elderly, brisk woman approached Sarah and placed a gentle hand on her arm. She said that in 50 years of watching the royal guards, she had never seen anything so beautiful and meaningful. The woman explained that her own son had served in the military, and she understood the loneliness and sacrifice that young soldiers endured far from home. Security guards finally reached the area, but instead of arresting Sarah or causing a scene, they simply asked her to step back behind the barriers. Their tone was respectful rather than harsh, and one of them quietly thanked her for showing such genuine care for their colleague. It was clear that even the security personnel had been moved by what they witnessed. Over the next hour, word of Sarah's spontaneous act of kindness spread throughout the remaining crowd at Buckingham Palace. People who had not witnessed it firsthand sought her out to hear the story and express their admiration for her courage in reaching out to comfort a struggling young soldier. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the positive response to something she had done purely from instinct. A journalist from a London newspaper appeared and asked Sarah if she would be willing to share her story. She agreed reluctantly because she hoped it might encourage other people to show kindness to military personnel who often felt invisible and unappreciated. Sarah wanted James and soldiers like her brother to know that people cared about their service and sacrifice. As the afternoon turned to evening, Sarah finally prepared to leave Buckingham Palace and return to her small hotel. She looked back one final time at James, who continued his silent vigil at his post. He seemed to sense her gaze and turned his head slightly in her direction, offering another barely visible smile that made her heart sing with joy. The story of Sarah and James spread across social media within hours of her return to the hotel. Videos and photos of their emotional exchange were shared thousands of times, with comments from people around the world who were moved by the simple act of human compassion they had witnessed. Many shared their own stories about military family members and the importance of supporting those who serve. Sarah received hundreds of messages from strangers, thanking her for reminding them about the power of kindness and empathy. Military families especially reached out to express gratitude for her recognition of the loneliness and challenges their loved ones faced while serving their countries. The response was overwhelming and humbling for a small-town teacher who had simply followed her heart. 3 days later, Sarah received a letter at her hotel from James, thanking her again for her kindness and explaining how much her gesture had meant to him during one of the darkest periods of his life. He included a photo of his sister and asked Sarah to remember her in her prayers. The letter became one of Sarah's most treasured possessions and a reminder that simple acts of love can change lives in ways we never imagine.